You think your job is bad. You have no idea what bad actually means. 2,000 years ago, there were jobs so physically destructive, so genuinely disgusting, that the people who did them were often social outcasts for life. Not underpaid, not overworked. Outcasts. People who couldn't marry into respectable families, couldn't enter certain temples, couldn't even be buried in the same ground as everyone else. All because of what their hands did every single day. 5 ancient jobs, ranked by how badly you'd survive them. Let's go. Number 5, the Roman fuller. Sounds harmless. It was not harmless. A fuller's job was cleaning and whitening wool and togas, and the cleaning agent of choice in ancient Rome was human urine. Not metaphorically, actual urine, collected in giant public jars on street corners, because ammonia breaks down grease and dirt extremely well, and ancient Rome had not yet invented a way to know that without finding out the hard way. Fullers stood knee-deep in vats of it, stomping cloth for hours, breathing the fumes the entire time. The Roman government taxed this urine collection so heavily that it became a genuine political talking point. There's a famous story about an emperor being challenged over the tax, and his response was essentially that money doesn't carry a smell, no matter where it came from. That phrase outlived the empire itself. People built entire businesses on jars of other people's waste sitting in the sun, fermenting into something stronger and more useful by the day. And the fuller, the person actually standing in it for hours at a time, got none of the glamour and all of the smell, permanently soaked into skin and clothing that never fully came clean again. Rome smelled better because someone else smelled unbearable for a living, and everyone in the city knew exactly who that someone was just by walking past them. Number 4, the medieval gong farmer. If fulling sounds bad, this is worse. A gong farmer's job, and yes, that was the actual professional title, was emptying cesspits and privies by hand at night, because doing it during the day was considered too disgusting for public decency. So they worked in near total darkness, digging out human waste with basic tools, hauling it in barrels through the streets to designated dump sites outside town, often making multiple trips before dawn. The work was so hazardous that gong farmers occasionally died on the job from the fumes alone, overcome by gas in enclosed pits with nowhere to escape and no one nearby to notice in time. They were paid relatively well for the era, sometimes more than a skilled tradesman, because almost nobody else would do it at any price. And they were also legally required to live outside city walls, separated from everyone else, because their smell and presence were considered a genuine public health concern by city officials. You could earn decent money doing this job. You just couldn't live near anyone while doing it, couldn't easily marry outside your own trade, and couldn't ever fully leave the smell behind, even after the shift ended. Number 3, the ancient tanner. Turning animal hide into usable leather required soaking it in a mixture that included lime, animal brains, and, again, urine and dung. This time specifically dog and pigeon feces, because the enzymes in it helped soften and break down the hide's fibers. Tanners worked barefoot in vats of this mixture, hands and feet submerged for hours at a stretch, absorbing whatever chemicals the process produced directly through their skin, day after day, for an entire career. Tannery districts were pushed to the edges of ancient cities, downwind whenever possible, because the smell was strong enough to be considered a civic emergency in its own right, with some cities passing laws specifically dictating how far from residential areas a tannery had to operate. In some ancient sources, tanners are described the way you'd describe someone working in a genuinely toxic, contaminated industrial site today. Except there was no protective equipment, no ventilation, and no alternative career path once you'd started. You needed leather for shoes, armor, straps, and tools. Somebody had to make it. That somebody stood in a pit of rotting animal matter and human waste for their entire working life, and their children very often inherited the exact same job, because nobody outside the trade wanted to marry into it. Number 2, the Egyptian embalmer. This one sounds prestigious, and in some ways it genuinely was. Embalmers held real religious and social status in ancient Egypt, operating almost like priests. But the actual physical work was brutal in ways the prestige never fully covered up. Mummification took around 70 days from start to finish, and part of that process involved manually removing organs through small incisions in the abdomen, extracting the brain through the nose with a long, hooked instrument, piece by piece, and packing the entire body cavity with natron salt to dry it out completely from the inside. Embalmers worked directly with decomposing human remains in the Egyptian heat for weeks at a time, with none of the preservation or sanitation technology we take for granted today, meaning the smell and biological risk were constant companions to the job. They handled disease, decomposition, and toxic natural compounds daily, and unlike the other jobs on this list, they weren't outcasts. They were specialists, sometimes wealthy, sometimes deeply respected. But the honor of the title did nothing to change what the job actually was underneath it. Prestige and horror sat in the same job description every single day for 70 days straight, per body, for an entire career's worth of bodies. Number 1, the Roman mine worker. And this is where brutal stops being a figure of speech. Roman mines, especially the silver and lead mines in places like Spain, were often worked by condemned criminals and enslaved people sentenced specifically to hard labor underground, a punishment called damnati ad metalla, condemned to the mines. It was functionally a death sentence with extra steps built in. Workers spent their entire remaining lives underground, in tunnels barely large enough to crouch through, breathing air thick with toxic metal dust, particularly lead, which causes slow, cumulative poisoning that affects the brain, the kidneys, and the nervous system, all while the person is still expected to keep working through it. There was essentially no such thing as retiring from this job. No recovery period. No medical care beyond whatever kept a laborer functional enough to keep swinging a pick. Life expectancy for mine laborers was brutally short, sometimes just a handful of years from the start of the sentence, and the rare few who survived years underground often survived with permanent neurological damage from the metal exposure alone. Shaking hands, memory loss, symptoms we'd now immediately recognize as heavy metal poisoning. Rome's silver coinage, the literal foundation of its economy and its ability to pay armies, build roads, and fund an empire, was mined by people who were, in every practical sense, being worked to death in the dark, underground, out of sight of the civilization their labor was funding. 5 jobs, each one absolutely essential to keeping an ancient civilization running. Clean clothes, working sewers, usable leather, proper burial, and the metal that funded entire empires. None of it happened by accident, and none of it happened for free, even when no wages were paid. All of it happened because someone, usually someone with no other choice, did the worst physical work imaginable so that everyone else could live a slightly cleaner, slightly easier life, without ever having to think about who made that possible or what it cost them. Which job would you have survived the longest? Tell me in the comments, and subscribe. Not for me, for the Fuller standing in that vat right now, who deserves at least one person 2,000 years later to know his job existed.